Here is a paradox that would have astounded even the most cynical courtiers of Henry's court: America, a nation founded on the revolutionary principle that all men are created equal, has created a society where human worth is increasingly measured by material accumulation rather than moral character. You live in an age where a person's value is calculated by their net worth, where success is defined by consumption rather than contribution, and where the pursuit of happiness has been perverted into the pursuit of possessions. I have witnessed empires rise and fall, seen kingdoms built on gold crumble into dust, and observed how the love of money corrupts even the noblest souls. Yet what strikes me most profoundly about your modern American materialism is not its excess, but its emptiness, how it promises everything while delivering nothing of lasting value. Today, I shall reveal how this obsession with material wealth has become the greatest threat to the very ideals upon which your republic was founded, and why returning to the principles of true prosperity might be your only path to genuine flourishing. Chapter 1: The Inversion of American Values. When your founders declared that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were unalienable rights, they understood something we grasped in our humanist circles: that true prosperity flows from virtue, not from accumulation. Yet observe how thoroughly these principles have been inverted in your contemporary society. Where once you might have asked, "What can I contribute to the common good?" you now ask, "What can I acquire for myself?" Where once success was measured by character and service, it is now calculated by credit scores and stock portfolios. This inversion represents more than cultural shift, it constitutes a fundamental betrayal of human dignity. In my observations of court life, I learned that when material gain becomes the primary motivator, every relationship becomes transactional, every interaction becomes instrumental, and every person becomes a means to someone else's financial end. Your modern economy has systematized this degradation of human relationships on a scale that would have shocked even the most acquisitive merchants of Tudor England. Consider how this materialistic obsession has transformed your most sacred institutions. Education, once understood as the cultivation of wisdom and virtue, has become primarily a credentialing system designed to maximize earning potential. Medicine, traditionally a calling to heal the sick, increasingly functions as a profit-maximizing industry where treatment decisions are influenced by financial considerations. Even family relationships suffer as parents work excessive hours to afford lifestyles that previous generations would have considered luxurious, sacrificing presents for presents, time for toys. The tragedy is not that Americans desire comfort and security; these are legitimate human needs. The tragedy is that you have been convinced that endless accumulation of material goods will satisfy desires that are fundamentally spiritual in nature. A man may own 3 houses yet feel homeless. A woman may possess closets full of clothes yet feel naked before life's real challenges. Children may have rooms full of toys yet hunger for their parents' attention and approval. This materialistic mindset has created what I can only describe as a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction, where enough is never enough because the goalposts of success constantly move upward. Your advertising industry has perfected the art of manufacturing discontent, convincing people that their current possessions are inadequate, outdated, or insufficient. This represents a form of psychological violence against human nature, which naturally seeks contentment and peace, not endless striving for more. Chapter 2: The Spiritual Poverty of Material Wealth. From my vantage point in Chelsea, where I entertained both wealthy merchants and learned scholars, I observed a peculiar phenomenon. Often, those with the greatest material wealth possessed the poorest understanding of life's deeper meanings. This pattern has reached epidemic proportions in your modern America, where spiritual poverty masquerades as material success, and where the accumulation of possessions serves as compensation for the absence of purpose. Your contemporary culture has embraced what I can only call the heresy of materialism, the belief that physical reality is the only reality that matters, that what can be counted is all that counts, and that what can be purchased is all that has value. This represents a catastrophic narrowing of human vision, reducing the magnificent complexity of human existence to a series of commercial transactions. You have created a society where people know the price of everything but the value of nothing. This spiritual impoverishment manifests in countless ways throughout American society. Mental health crises proliferate not because people lack material resources, but because they lack meaning, purpose, and genuine community. Anxiety and depression reach epidemic levels in the wealthiest nation in human history because material abundance cannot fill spiritual voids. Young people especially suffer from this disconnect, having been raised in unprecedented prosperity yet feeling profoundly empty and directionless. The worship of material success has created what we might call golden cages, lives that appear successful from the outside but feel hollow from within. I have observed in my own time how courtiers could possess great wealth yet live in constant fear of losing favor, how merchants could accumulate vast fortunes yet never find peace. Your modern version amplifies this tragedy exponentially, as entire careers are built around managing wealth rather than creating value, and as status anxiety drives people to maintain lifestyles they cannot afford to impress people they do not even like. Perhaps most tragically, this materialistic obsession has severed Americans from their own founding vision of human dignity and equality. When worth is determined by wealth, the principle that all are created equal becomes meaningless rhetoric. When success is measured solely by accumulation, the pursuit of happiness becomes corrupted into the pursuit of having rather than being. Your society has forgotten that true prosperity includes not just material comfort, but also moral character, meaningful relationships, intellectual growth, and spiritual depth. The irony is profound. In your relentless pursuit of material security, you have created unprecedented material insecurity. Credit card debt, mortgage stress, job anxiety, and retirement fears plague even those who appear successful by material standards. This suggests that the problem is not insufficient wealth, but misplaced priorities, a culture that has forgotten how to distinguish between wants and needs, between comfort and contentment, between having more and being more. Chapter 3: The False Promise of Consumer Culture. Your modern consumer culture operates on a fundamental deception that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the snake oil merchants of my era. It promises that external purchases can satisfy internal longings, that material acquisitions can fill spiritual voids, and that the next purchase will finally bring the happiness that all previous purchases failed to deliver. This represents perhaps the most sophisticated system of mass deception ever devised, one that transforms natural human desires for beauty, comfort, and security into engines of perpetual dissatisfaction. The mechanics of this deception are brilliantly crafted. Your advertising industry has mastered the art of associating products with fundamental human needs that cannot actually be satisfied through consumption. Cars are sold as freedom, cosmetics as self-worth, electronics as connection, luxury goods as status and respect. Yet the freedom promised by automobile ownership often leads to debt slavery. The self-worth promised by beauty products often produces deeper insecurity, and the connection promised by technology frequently results in greater isolation. This consumer culture has created what I observe as a peculiar form of modern idolatry, where material objects are invested with almost magical powers to transform lives and identities. Shopping has become a form of religious ritual, malls have become temples of consumerism, and brands have become sources of identity and belonging that previous generations found in family, community, and faith. Americans increasingly define themselves not by their character, relationships, or contributions, but by their consumption patterns, brand preferences, and lifestyle choices. The psychological manipulation involved in modern marketing would have astounded even the most cunning courtiers of my time. Algorithms now track individual preferences and vulnerabilities to deliver precisely targeted temptations. Social media amplifies comparison and envy by constantly displaying curated images of others' apparent success and happiness. Credit systems enable immediate gratification while delaying consequences, creating a dangerous disconnect between desire and responsibility. Perhaps most insidious is how consumer culture has corrupted the very concept of choice and freedom. Americans are told they live in the freest society in history, yet their choices are increasingly manipulated by sophisticated psychological techniques designed to generate compulsive buying behaviors. True freedom requires the ability to choose not to participate in systems that exploit human weaknesses, yet consumer culture makes such non-participation increasingly difficult by making consumption appear natural, inevitable, and even patriotic. This false promise extends beyond individual purchases to entire lifestyle narratives. The American dream itself has been transformed from the opportunity to build a meaningful life through honest work into a consumerist fantasy of endless upward mobility measured primarily by material accumulation. Young Americans are taught to aspire not to wisdom, virtue, or service, but to wealth, status symbols, and luxury consumption. This represents a profound betrayal of the humanist ideal that education should cultivate character rather than merely economic productivity. The result is a society trapped in what economists euphemistically call the hedonic treadmill, where each purchase provides only temporary satisfaction before new desires emerge. This creates a culture of perpetual wanting that mistakes motion for progress, acquisition for achievement, and having for happiness. Chapter 4: How Materialism Corrupts Democracy. The relationship between excessive materialism and democratic decay would not surprise anyone who has studied the fall of republics throughout history. When private wealth accumulation becomes the highest social value, it inevitably corrupts the civic virtues essential for democratic self-governance. I have witnessed how the love of money can transform honest magistrates into corrupt officials, how the pursuit of profit can override concerns for justice, and how economic inequality can undermine the mutual respect necessary for democratic discourse. Your American democracy faces a crisis that is fundamentally materialistic in nature, when everything becomes commodified, including political influence. Democratic institutions inevitably become tools for advancing private economic interests rather than the common good. The principle of one person, one vote becomes meaningless when wealth can purchase unlimited political influence through campaign contributions, lobbying, and media manipulation. Your founders understood this danger, which is why they sought to balance individual liberty with civic responsibility, private enterprise with public virtue. The materialistic mindset has transformed American politics from a noble calling to public service into a lucrative career path focused on personal enrichment. Politicians increasingly come from wealthy backgrounds, leave office to highly paid positions in industries they previously regulated, and make decisions based on economic calculations rather than moral principles. This creates a governing class whose interests often conflict with those they claim to represent, undermining the democratic ideal of government by and for the people. Economic inequality, driven largely by materialistic values that justify extreme wealth accumulation, has created social divisions that threaten democratic stability. When some Americans live in unprecedented luxury while others struggle with basic needs, the shared sense of common citizenship essential for democracy erodes. The wealthy retreat into gated communities and private services, effectively seceding from the common institutions that bind society together. Meanwhile, those left behind grow resentful and suspicious of democratic institutions that seem to serve elite interests rather than ordinary citizens. Consumer culture has also shortened attention spans and reduced complex political issues to simplistic consumer choices, treating democracy as a marketplace where politicians sell policies to voter consumers rather than a forum for deliberation about the common good. Campaign strategies increasingly mirror marketing campaigns, complete with focus groups, brand management, and emotional manipulation designed to sell candidates rather than engage in serious debate about governance. The materialistic obsession has corrupted education in ways that undermine democratic citizenship. Schools increasingly focus on economic competitiveness rather than civic education, producing graduates who understand market dynamics better than constitutional principles, who can analyze business cases but not ethical dilemmas, who are prepared for economic productivity but not democratic participation. This educational malpractice weakens democracy by failing to cultivate the knowledge, skills, and virtues necessary for self-governance. Perhaps most fundamentally, materialism undermines the moral foundation of democratic equality by suggesting that human worth correlates with economic value. When society treats people as human resources rather than human beings, when success is measured purely by material accumulation, and when poverty is seen as moral failure rather than systemic injustice, the democratic principle that all citizens deserve equal dignity and respect becomes impossible to sustain. The solution requires recovering what your founders understood, that democracy depends not just on political institutions, but on civic virtues that must be cultivated through education, example, and cultural commitment to the common good over private gain. Chapter 5: The Destruction of Community and Family. From my years serving in government and raising my own family in Chelsea, I learned that strong communities and stable families form the bedrock of any healthy society. Yet your modern American materialism has systematically undermined these fundamental institutions by prioritizing economic considerations over human relationships, mobility over stability, and individual accumulation over communal care. This represents nothing less than the dissolution of the social bonds that make civilization possible. The pursuit of material success has scattered American families across the continent in ways that would have been unthinkable in my era, when extended families often lived within walking distance for generations. Young adults routinely move thousands of miles from their birthplaces chasing career opportunities and higher salaries, severing the intergenerational bonds that traditionally provided wisdom, support, and continuity. Elderly parents find themselves isolated in institutional care rather than surrounded by children and grandchildren, while young families struggle without the practical and emotional support that extended family networks once provided. This geographic fragmentation reflects a deeper spiritual fragmentation caused by prioritizing economic opportunities over relational obligations. When material advancement becomes the highest value, family loyalty, community commitment, and place-based relationships are sacrificed for career mobility and financial gain. The result is a society of isolated individuals who may possess impressive resumes and investment portfolios but lack the deep relationships that provide meaning, support, and belonging. Materialism has also transformed the internal dynamics of families in destructive ways. Parents increasingly work longer hours to afford lifestyles that previous generations would have considered luxurious, trading time with their children for money to buy their children things. Family meals, once sacred times for conversation and connection, are replaced by hurried consumption of prepared foods consumed while staring at screens. Children learn to measure parental love by gifts received rather than attention given, creating a generation that confuses being provided for with being cared for. The consumer culture has invaded family relationships themselves, turning homes into showcases for material success rather than sanctuaries for rest and relationship. Families go into debt to maintain appearances, choosing larger houses they cannot afford over financial security, newer cars over reliable transportation, and expensive vacations over sustainable savings. This creates chronic stress that undermines the peace and stability families need to flourish, replacing contentment with anxiety, gratitude with envy, and cooperation with competition. Communities suffer similar destruction as materialistic values replace civic virtues. Neighborhoods become collections of strangers rather than networks of mutual support, as residents prioritize privacy and property values over relationship and responsibility. Local institutions that once fostered community connection, churches, civic organizations, neighborhood associations, compete unsuccessfully with entertainment options and career demands for people's time and attention. The economic mobility that materialism celebrates actually weakens social cohesion by constantly reshuffling populations and preventing the development of stable, long-term relationships that characterize healthy communities. When people view their current location as temporary stepping stones to something better rather than places to invest in and improve, they naturally withhold the commitment and care that community building requires. Perhaps most tragically, materialism has corrupted the understanding of success itself, teaching Americans to measure achievement by distance traveled from their origins rather than depth of contribution to their communities. This creates a culture of perpetual dissatisfaction where making it means leaving rather than improving, where success means escape rather than engagement, and where the most talented individuals abandon their communities of origin rather than investing their gifts locally. Chapter 6: The Environmental and Social Costs of Endless Growth. Having observed in my own time how the enclosure movement displaced rural communities for the sake of wool profits, I understand how economic systems that prioritize short-term gain over long-term sustainability inevitably create both environmental and social devastation. Your modern American materialism has elevated this destructive pattern to unprecedented levels, creating an economic system that treats both natural resources and human communities as expendable inputs in the pursuit of endless growth and accumulation. The environmental consequences of materialistic culture would astound anyone from my era, when the natural world still seemed infinite and unchangeable. Your consumer economy requires constant extraction of resources, production of goods, and generation of waste at scales that overwhelm the Earth's capacity for regeneration and absorption. Climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and resource depletion all flow directly from an economic system based on the assumption that infinite growth is possible on a finite planet. This represents a fundamental denial of natural law as arrogant as any heresy I encountered in my theological disputes. The materialistic mindset treats nature as a collection of resources to be exploited rather than a community of creation to be stewarded. This instrumental view of the natural world reflects the same dehumanizing logic that reduces people to human resources, communities to markets, and relationships to transactions. When everything exists primarily to be consumed, nothing has intrinsic value, dignity, or right to exist for its own sake. This philosophical error underlies both environmental destruction and social disintegration. Your throwaway culture exemplifies the spiritual emptiness of materialism. Products are deliberately designed for obsolescence rather than durability, creating artificial scarcity and forced replacement cycles that maximize profits while minimizing satisfaction. Americans discard functional items not because they are broken, but because they are no longer fashionable, forcing continuous consumption that exhausts both natural resources and human finances. This planned obsolescence represents a form of systematic waste that would have horrified the craftsmen of my era, who took pride in creating beautiful, durable goods built to last generations. The social costs prove equally devastating. Communities built around extractive industries suffer boom-and-bust cycles that destroy social stability and environmental health. Factory towns are abandoned when production moves to locations with cheaper labor, leaving behind contaminated landscapes and broken communities. The constant pressure for economic growth forces communities to choose between environmental protection and economic survival, a false choice that reflects materialistic values rather than natural law. Environmental injustice reveals how materialism perpetuates inequality by concentrating pollution and resource depletion in poor communities while providing clean environments for the wealthy. Those with the least economic power bear the greatest costs of materialistic excess, while those who benefit most from unsustainable consumption insulate themselves from its consequences. This violates the principle of justice that should govern any Christian society, creating a system where some profit from destroying what others depend upon for survival. The materialistic emphasis on individual consumption over collective well-being prevents the cooperation necessary to address environmental challenges. When people define themselves primarily as consumers rather than citizens, they focus on private purchases rather than public policies, on individual choices rather than systemic changes. This atomization of responsibility allows destructive systems to continue while placing impossible burdens on individuals to solve problems that require collective action. Most fundamentally, the growth-dependent economy contradicts the principle of sufficiency that should govern human economic activity. A truly prosperous society would aim for enough rather than more, for sustainability rather than growth, for regeneration rather than extraction. This requires recovering the virtue of contentment that materialism systematically destroys, learning to find satisfaction in being rather than having, in depth rather than breadth, in quality rather than quantity. Chapter 7: The Path to True Prosperity. After witnessing both the heights of material wealth and the depths of spiritual poverty in Tudor England, I learned that true prosperity cannot be measured by accumulation alone, but must encompass the full flourishing of human potential within just and sustainable communities. Your modern America stands at a crossroads where you must choose between continuing down the path of materialistic excess or recovering a more integrated understanding of human prosperity that honors both individual dignity and common good. True prosperity begins with the recognition that human beings are not merely economic units designed for production and consumption, but complex creatures with spiritual, intellectual, emotional, and social needs that cannot be satisfied through material accumulation alone. A genuinely prosperous society would prioritize the cultivation of wisdom over the accumulation of wealth, the development of character over the expansion of portfolios, and the strengthening of relationships over the acquisition of possessions. This requires a fundamental reorientation of values from having to being, from competing to cooperating, from consuming to creating. The path forward demands recovering the classical understanding of economics as household management rather than wealth maximization, focusing on how communities can provide for the genuine needs of all members rather than enabling unlimited accumulation by some members. This means designing economic institutions that serve human flourishing rather than abstract growth targets, that prioritize sustainability over short-term profits, and that measure success by the well-being of the least advantaged rather than the accumulation of the most privileged. Education must be reformed to cultivate wisdom and virtue rather than merely economic productivity. Young Americans need to learn not just how to make money, but how to make meaningful lives. This requires integrating intellectual, moral, and spiritual formation in ways that prepare students for citizenship and relationship, not just career advancement. Education should teach the art of living well, the science of sustainable prosperity, and the wisdom needed to distinguish between authentic needs and manufactured desires. Communities can be rebuilt through institutions that prioritize relationship over transaction, cooperation over competition, and long-term flourishing over short-term gain. This might include local currencies that keep wealth circulating within communities, worker-owned enterprises that distribute both profits and decision-making power, community land trusts that prevent speculation and ensure affordable housing, and time banks that allow people to share skills and services without monetary exchange. Families can resist materialistic pressure by choosing contentment over accumulation, presence over presence, and experiences over possessions. This requires the courage to opt out of status competitions, to live below rather than beyond your means, and to measure success by the quality of relationships rather than the quantity of acquisitions. Families that prioritize time together over material advancement often discover that they are actually more prosperous in every way that matters. Political reform must address the corruption of democracy by excessive materialism through campaign finance reform, lobbying restrictions, and institutional changes that reduce the influence of concentrated wealth on governance. Democracy requires a level playing field where good arguments matter more than deep pockets, where public service is motivated by civic duty rather than personal enrichment, and where policy decisions are made based on evidence and ethics rather than economic interests. Most importantly, the path to true prosperity requires recovering the spiritual dimension of human existence that materialism systematically denies. This does not necessarily require religious belief, but it does require recognizing that human beings have needs for meaning, purpose, beauty, transcendence, and connection that cannot be satisfied through consumption. Whether through contemplation, service, art, nature, or community, people need opportunities to experience the sacred dimensions of existence that give life its deepest satisfaction. The goal is not poverty or asceticism, but rather the classical ideal of sufficiency, having enough to live well without excess that corrupts the soul or damages the community. This represents a middle path between the extremes of material deprivation and materialistic excess, one that honors human dignity while respecting natural limits, one that provides security while maintaining freedom, one that celebrates prosperity while preserving virtue. Conclusion. As I reflect on the path that brought me from the halls of power to the Tower of London, I am reminded that the greatest treasures of life cannot be purchased, possessed, or taken away by earthly authorities. The integrity of conscience, the depth of relationship, the beauty of truth, and the peace of right action remain available to all who have the wisdom to seek them and the courage to live by them. Your American experiment began with the revolutionary insight that human dignity transcends material circumstance, that true freedom involves the liberty to pursue meaning and virtue, not merely wealth and comfort. Recovering this vision requires the same courage that your founders demonstrated in declaring independence from systems that reduced human beings to economic functions. Today, you must declare independence from the tyranny of materialism that has corrupted those founding ideals. The path to true prosperity lies not in accumulating more, but in appreciating what you already possess, not in competing against others, but in cooperating for the common good, not in consuming the world, but in contributing to its flourishing. This transformation begins in individual hearts committed to virtue over accumulation, extends to families choosing relationship over transaction, and culminates in communities dedicated to justice and sustainability. May you find the wisdom to seek true riches and the strength to live as free people, prosperous in every way that matters.